Welcome, Irish fans, to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. I am Vince D'Addario, and I am the football analyst here at irishbreakdown.com. And with me, as always, is Brian Driscoll. He is the publisher at irishbreakdown.com. And, you know, really, let's be honest with you. Can we get enough Freeman talk? I don't think so. Marcus Freeman is kind of the flavor of the day.
I still am an offensive guy, and I do want to start talking a little bit more about the offense, which is why we talked about the receivers.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll. I think that this is still an interesting topic, obviously, and
absolutely,
because it's the most unknown topic that we have is, what is Marcus Freeman's defense going to look like in Notre Dame, and then of course today we're going to talk about what that means for the Notre Dame linebackers.
Yes, and that is where we are headed today. And it does involve a little bit of speculation on our part, and I want to make sure that we say that up front. But we want to look at the linebacker position and what that might look like under the Marcus Freeman regime on defense, and how it's similar to what Notre Dame was doing at the linebacker position, and the differences that you will see. So we're going to compare and contrast. And then we're going to predict kind of what, this current depth chart that Notre Dame has, what that might look like in a Marcus Freeman defense. So that's the plan for today. And again, we're speculating. So are they going to run a 3-3?
Is more of what we're doing. I think that's a better way of saying it. Yeah.
Yeah, is Marcus Freeman going to run a 3-3-5? Is he going to run a 4-3? Is he, what is he going to run?
4-2-5, right.
There's a lot of different ways he can go about it. We might see multiple in a game. Obviously, that's one of the things that we like about Marcus Freeman. But the key here is, and I'll let you explain this, the defense for Marcus Freeman is more of a linebacker-driven defense versus what Notre Dame has done in the past under Clark Lee.
Right, and it's not a dramatic difference, but as we said in the past, the safeties got a lot put on their plate at Notre Dame, and they're still going to have to be important players in the Marcus Freeman defense, but there's a lot more asked of the linebackers in this defense, and I would even say, despite the fact that I don't think their linebackers were necessarily their best players, but it's just he's the linebacker coach, and I think he uses them as weapons a lot more. I think their success against the run is heavily dependent on the play of the linebackers, being gap disciplined, being aggressive. The defensive line will eat up space, but in a aggressive shooting kind of way. And if the defensive line can make plays, they want them to make plays. But, the linebackers really have to be a key part of this, because to really defend modern offenses, especially the really up-tempo RPO-based offenses, your linebackers have to be able to come downhill and rush just as effectively as they can drop into coverage and make plays against the pass. And when Notre Dame's linebackers were good doing both, the defense was outstanding. When their linebackers struggled a little bit with some of those areas, and look at the I think it was the second touchdown pass Alabama had on Notre Dame. It was a play where the Mike linebacker just didn't recognize a tight end drag and just turned it loose. So there was some inconsistency there, but I think overall, Notre Dame's linebacker depth chart, what's coming back is going to fit well into what Marcus Freeman does with the linebackers. And I think in some areas, guys are going to fit even better into what it's doing. And in some areas, guys aren't going to fit in quite as well. So, but I also think Marcus Freeman's a good enough football coach that he's not going to say, well, this is what we do. And if we don't have anybody that fits it, then we're just going to struggle there. He's going to make the necessary adjustments to make sure that what they're calling and what they're going with is going to fit what the personnel's best at. And so I think the interesting thing is, what is the battle's going to look like? I mean, you've got a new defensive coordinator and a new linebackers coach. How does that mean Drew White is still locked into a starting job? Is that potentially that maybe Drew White and Bo Bauer both start, depending on what happens at the weak side linebacker position? But it's going to make for an interesting spring, and I would imagine that he's going to say, look, everybody's new. Everybody's a first-year player in my defense, and so may the best man win. And they did use a decent rotation, not a heavy rotation, but they did play multiple guys, and the production there was really outstanding. But like I said, there's going to be a lot asked of the linebackers in this defense.
Well, and you and I had speculated a little bit during preseason before the 2020 year that, having Bo Bauer and gosh, why now
Drew
his name?
White.
Thank you. And Drew White on the field at the same time is not a bad move,
Right.
Especially considering what we ended up getting from the Buck linebacker position.
Right.
I really think they probably should have gone to that at some point during the season. Of course, they didn't, but
because it is a little bit of a limited pass defense combination.
I
That's
agree
the
with
problem.
you. Yeah, and I get that. I do get that. Like I said, that the lack of production from Buck, though, was I feel like you could have put anybody else there and you might have had some more production, but that's another conversation.
Yeah.
But
there were guys there that could have played that position better than the guy that started there.
There you go.
It was a
That's all
stubbornness and an unwillingness to put somebody else on the field. But that's like I said, that's
right.
a different conversation that no longer is relevant because that guy is now the head coach in the SEC.
And so that's why having a new guy as a position coach and as the coordinator excites me because I think you get some potential combinations that we might not have seen. Right. And that is intriguing to me. It's why, for example, I have people come in to evaluate my tryouts who haven't been at all the preseason work because I look, as a coach, I kind of get tunnel visioned as to what my guys can do, right? This guy can do this. This guy can do this. This is where this guy needs to be. I like having those fresh opinions from people. And that's what you're going to get with Marcus Freeman coming in. He's watched film on these guys. Right. He hasn't seen them practice. He hasn't seen them in the weight room. He hasn't seen, it's a fresh perspective, on these guys. And so that's the part that I really find intriguing with a coaching change and a philosophy change, even though the schematics aren't going to be drastically different.
Right.
They're
not making a huge philosophical change where all of a sudden they're running a 3-4 and they're looking for a couple Manti Te'os to play in the middle of the defense. Exactly. It's not that kind of change. There's going to be some emphasis changes.
Sure.
There's going to be some play calling changes. There's going to be some fit changes, but it's not an overhaul of the defense. And I think that is important.
Yes, I agree.
Because the personnel will fit.
Yes.
It may not be the same personnel that fit previously, meaning like we may not see the projected starters that we might have seen if Clark Lee were still the defensive coordinator, but it is a group that will fit. And so it's not like, take a guy like Osita Ekwonu, right, who hasn't really played yet. It's not like a situation where he was recruited to play in a defense that no longer really suits his skills. If anything, I think this defense actually suits his skills better. Right. Gives him more flexibility. So we'll kind of get into some of that here. And as we kind of kick it off, let's just kind of start, Vince. And we talked a little bit about it when we did, when we did some of our initial analysis of their defense. So let's just kind of take a look at this is a base look that you're going to see a lot from Marcus Freeman's defense. And this is going to be true whether it's a 4-2-5 or whether it's a 3-3-5. The only thing that would change is this doesn't change when they go to a 4 down. Right. This doesn't change, and that guy doesn't change. Occasionally, they'll take this guy out and just have those two, the weak side linebacker and the SLB, which is essentially what Notre Dame's rover is. And this is their basic, sort of alignment. This guy will stack here at times. This guy will stack here at times. But basically that is who they are, right? These were bigger guys. That's the interesting thing. They were much bigger at linebacker inside than Notre Dame was. And I don't know if that's necessarily desired, but that's what they went to. This is their Mike linebacker. He was 6'3", 235, certainly bigger than Drew White is. Their weak side linebacker, this is Darian Beavers. He was 6'3", 242. Wow. And so these are bigger dudes. And this guy was built more like a safety. This is Jarrell White. He was 5'10", 205. Now, the two backups were 6'2", 220, 6'2", 218. So I think they like a bigger body type. But like I said, this is who was the best player at that position. And so this is a second down play, I believe, against Central Florida, UCF. And this is what you see a lot, as far as how these linebackers are used. Now, what they do post-snap is going to change a lot, and they'll walk around and they'll show different looks. But this is the base look of what it is. And so it's not a whole lot different as from what Notre Dame does. The one thing I did notice that was different the last couple of years with Jarrell White is the strong side linebacker, is he plays off the ball a lot more like this. Whereas for Notre Dame, you'd have Jeremiah Wusu out here.
Okay.
kind of playing over the slot because this is the number 2 receiver because it's such a wide alignment. Occasionally he'll play in between two, but I mean, you'll see him off the ball a lot more, in between a lot more with the nickel down. Because now in a 3-3-5, and this is the position that it could impact, Vince, is in a 3 down, you now have an extra guy on the back end of the defense.
Right.
So, where at Notre Dame, they're 4-2-5, this guy's part of the 5. You know what I mean? In a 3-3-5, this guy's part of the 3.
And
he's not part of the 5.
In other words, he's part of the box.
Right.
And even though he's not
right.
That's what I'm saying. Even though he's not directly, behind the tackle or, head up on a guard, et cetera,
right,
he can very easily get in that box real fast and be a box player.
Right. Exactly. And so that's kind of, when you look at this, Vince, that's one of those things that you'll notice about this defense is because in a 3-3-5, what the advantage to a 3-3-5 is, and I've kind of come around to being more open to running a 3-3-5 than I was previously because he runs it so different. Mm-hmm. He runs it with the thought of being physical, being able to stop the run, but also having enough skill to defend the pass. And when you look at Notre Dame's schedule the next couple of years, there's a lot of teams that are going to be spreading it out and running the ball, but also going to throw it a bunch. And so how do you match up best with that is really a personnel grouping with 7 defensive linemen / linebackers really the best way to match up week after week after week. So you have to ask yourself, should we base out of a 4 down front that we can then go to a 3-3-5 against some of those more up-tempo spread type of fast teams? Or do we start at a 3-3-5 base, and then when we play a team that's more maybe a Stanford, a more pro-style team, we then adjust that week and put a 4th guy down? You're already going to have the 4 down as part of what you do, but which one becomes the greater emphasis? And part of this is going to be determined by Notre Dame looking at their schedule the next couple of years and saying, based on who we play, is it better suited for us to be a 4 down team or a 3 down team? And I think that's going to be the biggest determining factor. And I think the only player that really gets greatly impacted by that decision is going to be that SLB, which they call, it's a strong side linebacker, Sam linebacker, which is basically what Notre Dame's rover was. I think they've called it star in the past is what I think they've called it in the past.
Okay.
But I'm just going off what the depth chart in 2020 said. And that's what they called it on the depth chart in 2020. So
strong side.
They just said SLB,
okay.
MLB, WLB. So they went traditional. Sam, strong side, Mike, or middle, weak side, Will.
I haven't heard Sam, Mike, Will in a really long time, by the way.
Yeah. So that's kind of what they went with, and that's kind of how it goes. So that's the interesting thing is if you go with a 3-3-5, you now have a 5th DB on the field that's not the rover, which now gives you more flexibility on what you can do with that guy. You can walk him up off the edge and really have a 6-man box. You can go with a true 3-3 stack and bring him in the box. You can have him out in the window, which then he becomes an alley player. He's going to kind of, do you really want to throw these slant routes right here? Do you really want to throw these perimeter screens? Because we have an extra guy out here where the numbers are better for us. At the same time, that now puts the Will in a tougher coverage spot. So he's now going to be isolated more because he may not have as much safety help to that side since the safety is going to be down in the rovers inside a lot. So there's just a lot of different things to consider about different stresses that it's going to put on certain players. Doesn't make it better or worse. It's just different.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be within that, how are you finding who best fits in that look? And that's going to be the interesting part of what they do. So those are things that we're going to have to find out and see what Marcus Freeman is going to do moving forward.
Yeah, no question. And you kind of compared it to Notre Dame. I didn't know if you wanted to go any deeper into the comparison of alignment for Notre Dame, or do we want to move into production?
Let's kind of move into the usage and the production. I think alignment-wise, Vince, I don't think there's a ton of difference, to be honest with you.
I don't think so either. You mentioned the difference between where the SLB and the rover kind of line up, but that was, that's Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah.
Right.
Not necessarily the rover, if that makes sense.
Yeah. What it does for Notre Dame's linebackers is if they're in a 3 down front, it just how they're fitting is going to be different. Whereas opposed to, your Mike, you don't have a 3 technique and a nose you're worried about anymore. If you're that Will and you're reading flow away, your gap your response may be different. Your insertion point may be different because there's just that nose inside, or your backside help is now coming from a 5 technique. 5 technique being you're lined up outside the tackle, where Notre Dame's base defense, that buck, which is the will, had a 5 technique. Unless there's a tight end, then it'd be a 7 technique or a 9 technique. But they had that 3 technique, which is the defensive tackle, which means outside shoulder of the guard. So now you had that defensive end kind of protecting backside, and then you had that 3 technique kind of squeezing, and then you had a nose. Well, now you got that 5 technique and a nose. Well, that 5 technique is going to have to protect backside a little bit. So, or maybe you're going to smash the inside or the defensive end inside, and now that buck has to be the guy that protects the backside. So those things are going to be different. That's where they're going to have to make some adjustments if they go, and they're going to do some 3-3-5. I mean, that may not be their base, but it's going to be a part of what they do. I just don't see Marcus Freeman abandoning that. I don't see the sense in completely abandoning that when you consider that Notre Dame is going to have to play Clemson, North Carolina, Ohio State, teams that are going to want to throw the ball around a lot these next couple seasons. And then, of course, if they want to win on the big stage, you got to beat those teams. You got to beat Oklahoma. You got to beat Alabama. Teams like to throw the football.
Right.
So I don't think abandoning it would make a lot of sense. But, I mean, if you don't want it to be your base, there's some validity to that as well. So they're going to do it. So it's going to teach some new eye discipline, some new assignment situations. We might see the offensive line the offense maybe rip off a few more big runs in the spring, or hear about the offense ripping off a few more big runs as the linebackers get used to the difference in fitting behind a 3-3 defense, 3-down defense. But as far as where they line up, it doesn't really alter where they line up a whole lot.
Gotcha.
It doesn't necessarily even alter the desired skills to a degree, but it will a little, and we will talk a little bit about that as we kind of shift into the usage conversation.
All right, so let's talk about, because you said alignment isn't all that different, but we also said that Marcus Freeman's defense, the linebackers, it's much more of a linebacker-driven defense. So let's get a comparison up about what Notre Dame's linebackers did versus what Cincinnati's linebackers did.
Yeah, and there's 2 ways to look at that. One is how they're used, and second is how much production they had and how dependent was the defense on the production.
Yes.
So when we start with the usage, so basically this is taking the comparisons of similar positions, right? So for Notre Dame, the rover, the Mike, and the buck, and then for Cincinnati, it's the SLB, the MLB, the weak side, WLB, right?
Yep.
So run plays are run plays. Now, the interesting thing is Notre Dame played 2 more games than Cincinnati, but the number of snaps were about the same.
Oh, interesting.
Because Cincinnati's playing in the American Athletic Conference, where it's a bunch of offenses that want to run a lot of plays.
Yeah.
Cincinnati's own offense wasn't in the mode of Notre Dame, where they just wanted to, limit possessions. That's not who they were. So they actually ran a very similar number of snaps to Notre Dame. So I didn't feel like I needed to alter the projections. The numbers really came out almost even in the total number of snaps. So, for example, last year, the Rovers were on the field for 747 snaps or 741 snaps for Notre Dame, the combined snaps. And then for the SLB, it was 747. And Mike, it was 625 for Cincinnati, 735 for Notre Dame. And then at Buck, it was the opposite. Notre Dame had 632 combined snaps out of the buck, probably about 660, 670 if you added Jack Kaiser or Jack Lamb in there. And Cincinnati had 762 out of their weak side linebacker. So what that means is they would sub their buck out or Mike out, whereas Notre Dame would take their buck out at times. So when Notre Dame went to 3rd down, they would a lot of times take their buck out and put in Bo Bauer.
Take out their worst player. Shocker.
Right.
Okay. Anyway.
So, yeah, I know, right? So you're still on that, man.
I'm kind of fiery today.
Yeah, I love it. So this is kind of a usage thing. So essentially what this stands is these are the number of plays that in a passing situation. So a rundown is a rundown, right? Everybody's playing the run. Nobody's like dropping into coverage when it's a run play, right? So those don't really matter. The interesting thing is, what do you do when it's a pass play? How often do you blitz compared to another defense? How often do you drop in coverage? And I think when you look at the rover, it's very similar. I mean, these numbers here at the rover position compared to the strong side linebacker, very similar. So as you can see, the Notre Dame rover was on the field a little bit more in here compared to this, but even in less reps, you had 3 more rushes. So this is all from Pro Football Focus. Pro Football Focus tells you, per snap, whether they were in coverage, rushing the quarterback, or playing the run. So you'll see here, even with a smaller, not as dynamic player, Cincinnati still had a little bit more aggressiveness with how they used this player, where you see a big jump in aggressiveness. But I think I will say this: I did think Clark Lee did he used it. I'll bet you if we went back and looked at, and I should have done this before the show, and looked at how much the Rover was used as a blitzer pre-Jeremiah Wusu-Koramoah, I bet you this number would go down. This number right here would go down because it wasn't used as much. That was Clark Lee saying, hey, we've got a great athlete who can really put some pressure on the defense. Let's take advantage of it because, he was a really good coach. And that's what smart coaches do. They use their top players and they build around what those guys can do.
Shocker.
The big difference here is right here. Yep. Look at this pressure and usage inside compared to what Notre Dame did. Much more aggressiveness as far as getting after the quarterback here, which is needed when you're in a 3-down front. So essentially what this means is, for the inside linebackers, is they're almost always going to bring 4 rushers. In a 4-down defense, in a 4-down defense, that's going to be a defensive lineman, right? If they go to a 3-3-5, that means you're going to need to have being able to rush the quarterback as a skill that is required of whoever plays for you. That is where you could maybe see some differences in who's going to be the starter or who's going to play more come into play. Sure. So if things are close between 2 players, but one guy is a run defender and is a cover player, but one guy's much better at rushing the quarterback, then that could be an impact. And that's why I think losing Jack Lamb could hurts Notre Dame, in my opinion, because I think he's the one guy at Buck that has the combination of size that Freeman likes, that has the range athletically that Freeman likes, that can cover the way Freeman likes, but also can rush the passer the way that Freeman likes. So you look at that and say, that's going to be interesting to see how that position pans out. Because as you see here, Notre Dame did not really use that position much to rush the quarterback. Right. And when they did, it was usually on 3rd down. So really going to be interesting to see this. And the mic usage didn't surprise me when you watch the film, but it surprises you when you look at like the body type, right? Like that guy would not be playing for Notre Dame. With all due respect to Joel DeBlanco, he would not be playing in Notre Dame. Bo Bauer and Drew White would both be over him, but they still used him aggressively. What's he going to do with Drew White and Bo Bauer? That's going to be an interesting thing to see. Is it less aggressive? Is it more aggressive? Does he use their athleticism? And what I mean by less aggressive is if you have a more athletic player, you don't necessarily have to blitz him as much because you can just kind of let his natural read and reaction skills make more plays. If you have a guy who's less athletic, you need to give him a little bit of a head start. And that's what a blitz is. Sure. So those are things that factor into whether or not you're going to utilize more pressures. And so, and then obviously the same thing happens in the run game, Vince, whereas, if you are in a situation where you're in a 3-down front, you're going to see a lot more run stunts from the linebackers too, because again, you need to insert those players more to make sure that you're fitting all the gaps and being a little bit more aggressive and not letting the line just kind of get free releases to the second level, right? So I think those are areas where you're going to see more usage. So having linebackers that are able to attack the line of scrimmage aggressively and effectively is the one big difference that you're going to see. Clark Lee didn't need that in his defense. If he had it, he took advantage of it, but he didn't need it. And we saw that in 2018 with Drew Tranquill and Tavon Coney. They did not attack like with a lot of run stunts because they were so instinctive and smart veteran players. They just kind of read, react, flow to the ball, and the defense was geared towards funneling everything back inside. It's back to that last conversation of spill versus force. When they had Tavon Coney and Drew Tranquill, they wanted to use the rover, the corners, and the ends to flow everything back to the linebackers and just let those linebackers clean stuff up, right? This defense is a little bit more of a spill defense, or at least it has been, where it's like, if it's off tackle or outside, we want to force it to the perimeter.
And then gang it up.
Right. So will that be the same? Or will he make the adjustment to say, hey, we got really rangy linebackers. Let's funnel everything back into them. So that's another thing that we're going to need to see. And you don't necessarily married into one. It's more about if you're a 3-3-5 and you've got all those extra perimeter players, that's where your numbers are good. So that's where our rangy athletes are. If you're a 4-2-5, you're a little different. You don't want guys to get outside because you have one less defender on the perimeter than a 3-3-5 team does. So that's the difference, where that decision could force them to change whether we want to be more of a spilled team or more of a force team.
And I guess what worries me about pushing guys outside when you're at Notre Dame is you're going up against competition that's a little bit different than at Cincinnati, just in that there's some more explosive type athletes that if they get out on the edge, they can make some things happen that can be bad. But I also understand your point that if you're in a 3-3-5, that's where you've got numbers. And of course you want to go to where you've got the numbers. I get that too. Yeah. So it is going to see what that balancing act is. Yeah. Because they're going to face off with some teams that have some dudes in the backfield.
I would also argue that Marcus Freeman is going to have more dudes at Notre Dame than he had at Cincinnati. I think it's relative. Yeah. When you say, well, he's going to face better athletes. Well, true, but he's going to have better athletes to face those better athletes with. So that's the thing he has to figure out is there a gap? And that's why I say you look at that schedule and say, okay, in the AAC, they made the decision. They were a 4-down defense when him and Luke Fickell. I've heard different ways, so whatever. I'm gonna switch it each time. I'm gonna say Fickle this time. All right. But when they first got to Cincinnati, they were a 4-down defense, and they were 4 down based on that's kind of who they had been. But they looked at the schedule and said 4 down doesn't give us the best chance to match up personnel wise with who we're facing week after. So that's what's going to go into this decision is them studying their opponents. But you think USC is an air raid team. Well, 3-3-5 is the way that Marcus Freeman runs. It's a great defense to have against the air raid, who doesn't want to run the football. Absolutely. You look at North Carolina, 3-3-5 could work really well against North Carolina. Against Clemson, there's some advantages to it. So, and then we saw against Georgia when Cincinnati faced Georgia that it was very easy for them to transition into a 4-2-5 or even a 4-3 defense against them. So I'm interested to see what they do, but I think that's the rub is okay. Yeah, they're facing better competition, but Cincinnati didn't have a whole lot of Jeremiah Wusus and Prince Collies and Osita Egwanus and Jack Kaisers and Maris Luafals on their roster either. Yeah, so that's the thing that you got to figure out. But they may be athletic, but are they better run defenders? Are they better cover guys? Are they better blitzers? Those are the things that Marcus Freeman's going to have to figure out as he gets into it. But the other thing too is to kind of back up, Vince, if we can kind of get back to what we were discussing earlier, the production aspect of it. Yeah. The dependency upon production. And I think you see here, Notre Dame, like right here, Rover, from a disruption standpoint, Cincinnati could match what Notre Dame did last year and exceeded it. Especially when you consider who Notre Dame had here, that's an impressive thing. 2 things factor into that, however. Okay. Number one, teams were not trying to avoid Jarrell White and the other Rovers or the Sam linebackers. Teams purposely avoided Jeremiah Wusu-Koramoah. So that's why you're going to see this number be a little bit different, right? And this number be a little bit different. This is the one that was interesting, however. But again, I want to point out that part of the reason that you can do more of this pressuring with your Rover as Sam linebacker is because you now have an extra defensive back outside to protect the perimeter if you blitz him. Right. So that's something to think about too. Yep. Inside, obviously Notre Dame had a lot more production at Mike, which isn't surprising. They had better players. And as we saw from a snap standpoint, the Mike linebackers at Cincinnati, right, they were on the field 625 snaps. Notre Dame's Mike linebackers are on the field 735 snaps. And when you consider that Bo Bauer was a nickel or one of their nickel players, that adds to it as well. But so I think you could see some jump in production here. This production was similar. I think that Cincinnati's coverage was much better at that position than what Notre Dame had. But run game production was similar, but this was from 4 guys. This was really from 2. So that was one difference as well, where you have to add some of this production right here for Notre Dame was on special teams. And it was hard for me to kind of figure out what were special teams tackles and what not. So these numbers aren't even as – because, a lot of those guys played special teams. So that is something that I think the gap in production at Buck compared to the Will linebacker is a pretty big difference. And some of the top production that Notre Dame had came from guys who weren't regular players, So that is a position that I'm curious to see how that pans out. But when you add these together, Notre Dame clearly had a lot more production inside than Cincinnati had against the run, but Cincinnati had 4.5 sacks compared to Notre Dame's 3 inside. So I think that fits back to when we showed earlier that ability to, or willingness to blitz that guy. You're going to get more pass rushing opportunities when you have to or you choose to insert a linebacker as that fourth rusher more often. Yeah. So those are the things that you really have to take into account when looking at who's going to play and who fits where.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And you're going to see, basically, bottom line is you're going to see more active linebacker play. I mean,
if they go with a 3-3-5, I'm not sure.
You need to bring in that fourth.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we're going to see a whole lot different if they go to a 4-2-5. If they stay with a 4-2-5, okay. Or if they go to like a 3-4 look where instead of because I could even see them going with a 3-4 look where you have the 3 down linemen, you have the same 3 linebackers, but you now have a fourth / hybrid end outside linebacker type of guy that's a stand up a lot. I could even see something like that, where it's sort of like a drop end position. That might be easy to adopt for Marcus Freeman. So there's a lot of possibilities, but I think the 3-3 is the one where you're definitely, I can say confidently, you're going to see a lot more downhill from the Notre Dame linebackers in that look. I don't know, and this is literally not saying it's not going to happen, but more of a literally I don't know if we'll see as much of that in a 4-2-5 look, because now when you insert a linebacker, you have 5 guys. You're now one less guy in coverage. Whereas now when you're inserting a linebacker, that's the 4th guy. There's still 7 guys in coverage. So that remain. I guess saying I don't know if we're going to see it is maybe confusing. It remains to be seen what we will see if they choose to go with a 4-down look from the linebackers.
Well, let's quickly go through the Notre Dame depth chart and where you see the guys that are currently on the roster fitting in. Are they going to stay where they're at? Or do you see them moving around? Like, what kind of combinations do you see, or at least at each position where guys fit the best?
Yeah, so some of these positions, it's going to be the same. I mean, you're going to see Isaiah Pryor and Paul Mawala playing that Sam linebacker / rover position. You're going to see Bo Bauer is going to be a Mike. I mean, that's not going to change. Shane Simon is a guy that I'm curious to see what they do with him. And part of what they do with him is going to be determined by what they do with Drew White. Is Drew White maybe a guy that can play the will in this defense?
Sure.
I'd be curious to see that. I could see a scenario in which, as you and I talked about, because you're going to be inserting your linebackers more, because now a double inside linebacker stunt doesn't expose you as badly as it did in a 4-2-5, where now you've got 6 guys coming. Maybe you can drop your end, but it left them in a more challenging situation where you can be more aggressive with both your inside guys. You have a little bit more protection and coverage now because you have a 5th true defensive back there. So I could see that potentially being a scenario in which they go with that. So I think that's curious. I think one thing they have to do, however, one of the Bucks, either Marist or Jack Kaiser, I'd prefer Jack Kaiser, needs to move to the strong side, to that rover spot. I think that with the intention of giving him a legitimate chance to compete for the starting job. Number one, Paul Mawala is coming off an Achilles injury, and those are more damaging. Those are more challenging for guys coming back to get their full range of motion, mobility, and explosiveness back than a knee injury is now.
Sure.
So, and that happened like 3 games into the season, and the season started late, which means it was much deeper into the season than it might have seemed otherwise playing in the 3rd game. I think it was October when that happened. So there's some uncertainty there of him. Isaiah Pryor, I don't know if he's done anything that makes you say, yep, he's definitely the guy. Right. I think one of those,
honestly, if the guy, and I don't know that I have a whole lot of basis for that. It's just the fact that they moved in positions. Right. He good on special teams. I just don't know that I'm prepared to be excited about him being a starter.
Yeah. I'm curious to see what he can do this spring and in fall camp. But to your point, no, I'm not putting competition out there. And I think Jack Kaiser to me would make a lot of sense. I don't know if I want Jack Kaiser playing inside all the time. I just, especially now in a defense where we have one less lineman protecting him. I don't know if he's just too small. He's got a perfect rover frame and he can flat out run. I think one of the things people don't appreciate about Jack Kaiser is he is very athletic. And so I don't think playing Rover would be any issue for him. Now, what I don't know is he comfortable playing in space as a linebacker? I don't know. But the kid was a free safety in high school and was a phenomenal free safety in high school. And was a big part of why he won the Mr. Football Award, despite playing 1A football in Indiana. I think that was the first time ever, Vince, that you had a 1A kid win Mr. Football. And so tremendous talent and athlete. And I just think this defense, he's the guy to me that if you had to pick one linebacker that's going to benefit most from this transition, it'd be Jack Kaiser if they move him outside.
I agree.
Yeah. And so then you got to find out, Shane Simon to me is more of a Mike, but Clark Lee kept playing him at Buck. I'd be curious to see if they're going to leave him at Buck and let him take a chance. I don't know if you can do that because you need a rangier, better cover player at that position. But maybe the light goes on. Maybe the Marcus Freeman defense sinks into him more. I mean, he's got all the physical tools. It's up here, the instincts, the mental part, the read and react and just attack. Osita Ekwonu is another guy that I'm really curious to see how they utilize him because he's very athletic, very physical, very rangy. Does he fit into that Buck position? Is he going to be suited to challenge there? So those are some of the guys that I'm curious to see how they fit. I would personally move Jack Kaiser out to Rover. I'm just going to use the name terminology for now. I would let Marist and Shane Simon battle it out at the weak side position, unless you feel you need to get Bo Bauer and Drew White on the field together. I personally would not, because I think that would be a good alignment against the teams that are run heavy. But if I'm an offensive coordinator, I'm going to do some really interesting things with my tight ends and running backs if you're going to throw Drew White and Bo Bauer at me on a consistent basis. I just feel like that puts Notre Dame in some tougher pass game matchups against some of the better teams on the schedule. So I would have those two guys at Mike, and I would just allow them to play together. And I think there are certainly scenarios in which they can play together, short yardage, goal line, teams that are run heavy. But I would give Marist every opportunity to win that Buck job because I think his skill set is really well suited for that. I think he's also thin, but he can better handle the physicality of it than Jack Kaiser can, who just tends to get overwhelmed because Marist is so long, where Jack's not a super long kid, where at least not long in the standpoint of you want him taking on guards all day. Whereas I think Marist is better suited for that. He's skinny, but he's got really impressive punch and power for a skinnier guy. So I would give him every chance in the world to beat out Shane Simon. And if Shane Simon does start, then that means he had to play really well in order to do it. So great. Then I also want to see what Osita does, like I said, and Prince Colley, the incoming freshman. Yeah. Rover was the position for him. I really like him at this new weak side linebacker position. I would almost say just move him now. I mean, don't even do the Rover movement. Just move him now because I think he's a guy that very early in his career has the athleticism, the downhill ability, the physicality, and the coverage ability to be a star at that position. So that's kind of where I would go with it. And if I had to project a starting lineup, it would be Jack Kaiser, Drew White, and Marist would be my projected starting lineup. But Bo Bauer, Shane Simon, and Isaiah Pryor are certainly not going to go down without a fight.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm excited to see it. I hope we get an opportunity to see it in the spring. Yes, I realize that's a pipe dream. I'm gonna keep wishing upon a star that we get a chance to see some of this in person in the spring in about a month and a half, maybe 2 months. So yeah, I'm excited about that. But stay tuned, folks, because we're gonna have more breaking down the Marcus Freeman defense. And we're going to go more to the offensive side to make my partner and myself, let's be honest, happy because we're both offensive guys and we love talking about the offense. But we got a fun one for you tomorrow, and it is an offensive one. And we'll get into more detail in that podcast and over on YouTube. So make sure you stay locked in to irishbreakdown.com. Got some great stuff going on over there. If you're watching us on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button. Where is it, Brian? Point it out.
It's right about here in this corner right there.
There you go. So make sure you hit that subscribe button. If you're listening to us on a podcast, make sure you subscribe there as well. Rate, review, whatever you feel like doing. But until we talk to you next time, that's Brian Driscoll. I'm Vince D'Addario, and you've been listening to the Irish Breakdown Podcast.